chair again. I've been promised tomorrow will be a slightly less hectic day, but I must say I'm really enjoying it. Christian, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm very happy to be here. So far, this has been a very amazing workshop, so I hope the quality will keep up. It will be a little bit different than what we've seen before, but I hope you still enjoy it. So my talk today is called Dysfunction Does Not Imply Impairment, the curious case of aphantasia. And I will not start with defining what a dysfunction is. Instead, I will go the other way around. I will talk about the case of aphantasia, and then in the end, I'll see whether we can maybe derive some ideas about dysfunctions from that. All right, so this is the plan. First, I will set out what I refer to as the puzzle of aphantasia competency. Then I will suggest that a possible solution to this puzzle is to posit what I call the alternative strategy solution. Then I will try to show that this can be actually modeled within the mental files framework. And then in the end, I will try to kind of extend all of this to a more general concept, which I will then refer to as cognitive substitution. All right. So let's get started with the puzzle of aphantasia competency. So just out of curiosity, who here is familiar with the term aphantasia? Maybe you can give me a show of hands. Okay, that's actually way more people than I expected. It's definitely more people than last year when I asked the same question. Maybe it's the crowd as well. But yeah, to just still, for those who do not know, I want to start with a little experiment. So I would like to ask all of you to try to visualize an apple. And you can all decide if you want to keep your eyes open or close them to do this, but just try to visualize an apple in as much detail as possible. And I'll give you a few moments to do so. Brilliant. Okay. That was. Yeah. So, you all know for yourself what you experience. I will not ask you about this, but I did this in order to introduce the idea that we can think about mental imagery as ranging along a spectrum of imagery vividness, right? So on the one extreme side, which is here number one, we would have a condition that would be called hyperphantasia, right? So you would be in this condition if your mental imagery is as vivid as real seeing, right? So really almost like a photorealistic apple, maybe like a droplet running off the apple, a shadow, like almost indistinguishable with actually perceiving an apple. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum is what is referred to as aphantasia, namely it was originally called a condition of reduced or absent imagery, right? So this would be number 5 here. So people with aphantasia, when they try to visualize, they do not have any visual experience. They just see black, as if you close your eyes and then you see the dark inside of your eyelids, right? Now, there are different versions of how aphantasia is defined, but I will just let you know that the working definition that I will be using today for my talk will be aphantasia is an inability to voluntarily generate visual mental imagery. Quite a mouthful, but it's important that we classify this. So this will be the target for my presentation today. Okay, very briefly on the taxonomy of aphantasia. So you can have acquired aphantasia. That means you had the ability to form visual mental imageries voluntarily, but then you lost it. For example, this can happen as a result of a brain damage, for example, or a brain surgery. So this would then be considered a neurogenic case of acquired aphantasia. But it can also happen as a result of a psychological disorder. So for example, a depersonalization disorder or a major depressive episode. If we want to say that, of course, depression is dysfunctional, this would then be a psychogenic case of acquired aphantasia. But there are also cases of congenital aphantasia, which is lifelong aphantasia, right? So these people are born already with the inability, they never once had the ability to form visual mental imagery to begin with. Okay, and maybe one last thing on this. I will be talking here about the visual modality. There's now evidence that aphantasia also exists in, for example, olfaction or auditory imagery, right? But it was initially defined as this visual modality specific condition. And this is also how we'll treat it. Just for you to know, there are also other sense modalities in which you might experience aphantasia. Perfect. So now, why is aphantasia puzzling or even interesting for us? Well, this is because the current dominant view, and not just currently, but historically, I would say, with few, intermissions, is that actually imagery is very important for our overall cognition. So Aristotle already said in De Anima 3 that the soul never thinks without an image. And if you want a more contemporary proponent of this position, you can take, for example, Benson-Nene, who wrote in the preface of his book, Mental Imagery, that memory, senses, and understanding are all of them founded on mental imagery. But now, if this were so, then we would expect that people who cannot voluntarily generate visual mental imagery, and keep in mind, visual imagery is also assumed to be very important. We are supposed to be visual creatures, right? We would expect these people to be quite cognitively disabled or impaired, right? However, interestingly, as I will show in this presentation, aphantasics are not just not gravely cognitively disabled, they are even able to solve tasks that were supposed to require the explicit use of visual mental imagery, right? So this then naturally calls the dominant view into question. All right, so now I want to look at two examples. Later I will look at the third one with you, but first two examples of tasks that aphantasics were not expected to be able to solve. So the first example are so-called mental rotation tasks, which go back to Shepard and Metzler's in the 1970s. And this is the task, so you're being presented with a number of three-dimensional figures, and then you ask whether, for example, figure A is the same figure as the standard figure, only rotated by a specific degree of rotation. So I will just let you, have the experience of trying to solve this for yourself very quickly. Again, no need to tell me the answer, but the important thing here is that usually when visualizers are doing this, right, so non-aphantasics, when they're doing this, they experience this as forming and then rotating a mental image of one of these figures and then seeing whether there's like a match with another figure, right? So if this were so, then we should expect that aphantasics cannot do this, right? Because they cannot form, let alone then rotate the mental image of the figure. All right, moving on to the second almost group of questions, I would say. This is what I refer to as visual detail questions, right? And this can be questions, for example, about the relative color of objects. So for example, is the green of grass darker than the green of a pine tree, right? Or it can be questions about the shapes of animal parts, like are a cat's ears floppy or upright, for example, right? And again, you can see how you yourself would solve this task. But with respect to the first question with the different shades of green, most people would probably visualize grass and then visualize pine trees and then sort of read the description of the mental image, or so it seems, right? And with respect to the question about the cat's ears, well, maybe you visualize a cat, and then because you're specifically interested in the ears, you sort of like zoom in on your mental image. And some of you might find that strange, but this is actually how Stephen Kostin, one of the most important people in mental imagery, is describing it in his book, The Case for Mental Imagery. So he is saying, if one has visualized object properties, one inspects the image pattern by shifting the attention window over it to encode properties. For example, as would occur if one were asked what shape are a cat's ears, and so visualize the cat's head and examine the shape of its ears. So if we buy into this, then again, we would think that aphantasics should not be able to answer these sort of visual detail questions, right? Because they're not able to form, let alone inspect any sort of visual mental image. Now, the surprise is that actually aphantasics are able to solve these tasks. They're able to solve mental rotation tasks. This has been shown in a number of studies, and they're also able to solve these visual detail questions. And also they're able to solve another task that I will discuss in some more length later, namely visual memory tasks. Now, this puts us in a very interesting position, right? Because if we assume that the ability to form visual mental images voluntarily would be a cognitive function, then aphantasia could be described as an imagery dysfunction, right? However, we now see that aphantasics are not actually impaired with respect to tasks where we would expect this function, okay, this is a bit misleading, that function to play an important role, right? So this then brings me to what I refer to as the puzzle of aphantasia competency, namely the question of how can aphantasics successfully perform visual mental imagery tasks? And there are a couple of different answers that you could provide. The answer that I want to provide today is that, well, actually, we were mistaken in thinking that these visual mental imagery tasks necessarily require the use of visual mental imagery, and aphantasics actually solving these tasks by means of using alternative cognitive strategies. And this brings us to the next part, alternative strategies. So here I think it is very interesting to look at how aphantasics themselves are describing their experience, not necessarily with respect to these specific tasks, but just in general. How do they imagine? Because it is a fallacy to think that aphantasics cannot imagine. They can be very imaginative, they can be very creative, they just do not have visual mental imagery. So first I want to look at two accounts of aphantasics describing how they imagine a beach. So this first example is from Ross, and he is writing about his experience by saying, if you tell me to imagine a beach, I ruminate on the concept of a beach. I know there's sand, I know there's water, I know there's a sun, maybe a lifeguard. I know facts about beaches. I know a beach when I see it, and I can do verbal gymnastics with the word itself. But I cannot flash to beaches I've visited. I have no capacity to create any kind of mental image of a beach, whether I close my eyes or open them, whether I'm reading the word in a book or concentrating on the idea for hours at a time, or whether I'm standing on the beach itself. And I grew up in Miami, right? So what we can see here, I want to argue, is that, well, Ross does not have a visual mental image of a beach. He nonetheless has access to facts about beaches. We could say that he uses these facts based on his semantic memory, for example, right? And now let's look at another example. So this is from a Reddit post from the subreddit on Aphantasia from the user &Justin. And he posted these two pictures with the following description. I made this to describe how aphantasia affects me. The example I used is someone telling me to close my eyes and imagine a beach. Birds flying, waves rolling in, sand. The first picture is what I visualize. The second picture is how my brain works it out. I know what these things are, I just cannot see them, right? So here again, you could say, well, to talk quickly about the two pictures. So the first picture, right, this is just his actual visual experience. It's just like black. There is no visual experience. It's as if you close your eyes, you just see the black within your eyelids. And then the second picture is how he kind of conceptualizes this. And here we can see that just as for Ross, he knows facts about beaches, right? He knows that there is a sun, a water, the sky, and all of that, right? But what is very interesting is that he also here presents them as being spatially distributed, right? So the beach is at a different spatial location than the sky. And if you would give this now to a talented artist, they could probably, based on just this description, draw you a very perfect visual image of a beach, right? And now compare this with one last example. So this is an illustration from Facebook. And I think this might be slightly misleading because there are also like colors and specific shapes involved here. But I would just for now like accredit this to like artistic license. But I think what is reoccurring is this idea of having concepts, or better maybe to say verbal labels that are spatially distributed, right? Okay. So now next, I want to talk about a little study, really a little study that I did as part of my master thesis as well. So what I did is I talked with congenital aphantasics, right? So people who never had the ability to visualize, at least according to themselves. And I gave them the following task. But it's important to understand that I didn't give them this actual task, but I asked them how they would imagine they would solve this task, right? So the task is the following. You are constructing a cupboard and have to drive a screw into the wood of the cupboard wall. In another room, you have a set of screwdrivers of different sizes, which you can use for the task. What strategy would you use in order to pick the correct screwdriver? And I then looked at all the answers. This is, of course, qualitative research, right? And I tried to group them into categories, and I came up with the following 3 categories. So the strategy categories are first, internal description, then external reference, and then spatial sense. And I will just very quickly give you an example of each of these categories, right? So for internal description, one person said, I would look at the screw head to see if I needed a Phillips head or a regular screwdriver. I would describe to myself the approximate size of the screw head, right? So the idea here is that this person is looking at the actual screw, right? And then they're making a sort of like a verbal list, again, semantic facts that they can then repeat to themselves, like in their heads, in the other room, in order to find the right screwdriver. Now, example for external reference would be participant 22. This person said, I would indicate what the size of the head of the screw is on paper, or if that isn't available, measure against something like my fingernail, right? So here the idea is that you use some sort of reference object, like your fingernail, parts of your body, or other material, in order to create a reference frame that you can then use in order to extrapolate information from them. And the last strategy is what I refer to as spatial sense. So here, for example, participant 6 is saying, while I definitely can't visualize, I do have a good spatial sense, and that seemingly includes relative sizing. So I can take note and remember the size of the screw for at least the amount of time it would take to pick out an appropriate screwdriver. See, now this might seem a little bit mysterious to some of the people, at least that can visualize, right? Because you would think, well, but spatial sense and the idea of spatial objects, isn't that just, basically expressed in my visual mental image, right? Is not that where I get my spatial information from? And I hope that the next study that I will discuss can bring some clarity into this, not confusion, but, you know, idea. So this is a study conducted by Bainbridge and colleagues in 2021. Don't worry, I will not give you any tables. I know people are very afraid of tables here now, but we look at pictures. Pictures are nice, right? So aphantasics and control subjects, so normal visualizers, were given pictures like of rooms. You can see them here. And then they were asked to draw these pictures in one condition from memory, right? And in another condition while they're actually looking at it. So just like to copy the image, essentially, right? So here's some of the examples from aphantasics. So again, here's from memory and here's from the perception from looking at it. And here's the some examples from some of their control participants, right? So what did they find in this study? Well, they found that aphantasics, on average, compared with the normal visualizers, the controls, drew fewer objects. They also used fewer colors. You can see that a little bit in the comparison up there. But also, crucially, they made fewer mistakes, right? So visualizers tended to add in objects in their drawings from memory that were not actually in the actual image. And this can become quite relevant, for example, if you think about something like witness reports, right? Like in court, when it comes to you know, how you witness a crime or an accident or something, there you would really not want somebody to remember falsely things that weren't there. So maybe there actually aphantasics would have an advantage over the visualizers, but this is a bit of an aside. So what we also see is that they used more labels. And I'm not sure if you can see this here, but in the first picture, put a little red circle around it. Some aphantasic wrote fireplace, where they have like a very crude approximation of what this fireplace could look like, right? So this might remind us of the cases of the beach where people are using basically spatially distributed verbal labels, right? And
sorry,
yeah,
is it just in the memory picture that they use like less objects and stuff, or also in the perception picture?
that's a very good question. I mean, because this is like I'm trying to argue here for like visual memory tasks. So I was mostly looking to the memory condition. I would have to look into the perception as well. I was not looking so much into that, but that is a good question. That is a good question. Like at least with respect to the memory condition, for sure they did this. So these data points definitely apply to the memory condition. If they extend to the perception condition, I would have to check. So sorry, what was that? Ah, yeah, exactly. So what is very interesting, however, is that aphantasics showed intact spatial imagery abilities. What does that mean? That means that the spatial layout of the rooms from aphantasics that they drew from memory was very well reserved, actually. They made almost no mistakes with respect to the spatial organization of the items in the room. And this also reflects some other results where aphantasics actually reported to have intact spatial imagery abilities. And the cases of, you know, my own little study where people say that they use spatial sense might be seen also as you know, converging evidence towards that. And lastly, I think it's important to keep in mind that if we think about this as a visualizer, you know, if you drew something from memory, most likely you would try to call up a mental, you know, visual mental image of that room, for example, and then try to draw based on this mental image. So again, if we would think that, if we think along the lines of Koslin, that you have to first call up the image and then inspect it, then we should again expect that aphantasics are not able to solve this task. However, aphantasics were able to solve the task, as we can see here. However, you might still be a little bit not sure about how, like, what to think about spatial imagery. And I think what might be helpful here is an actual comparison between what is referred to as object imagery and spatial imagery. And both of these are seen to be part of visual mental imagery. So object imagery essentially involves representations of visual features, so something like color or texture, right? Spatial imagery, on the other hand, represents spatial structures, motion, relative location of objects, right? And the interesting thing here is that there's actually a different neural correlate for each of these types of imagery. Namely, in the case of object imagery, it is the ventral pathway, and in the case of spatial imagery, it is the dorsal pathway. So here's a little graphic for you to look at this. So the dorsal stream is also called the where stream because of, you know, location, and then the ventral stream is referred to as the what stream, right? And this shows us that, okay, there could actually be a dysfunction where, for example, aphantasics have a dysfunction specifically with respect to the ventral stream, right? Whereas the dorsal stream functions fine. And so they might not have any actual visual experience, but they might still be able to use these spatial imagery abilities, right? And if we consider this, then maybe also the performance on the Aphantasia mental rotation task makes a lot of sense, because this seems to be very relevantly involving the spatial features of the blocks, but not so much, color or texture or anything like that. All right, great. So a little interim summary at this point. So I have hopefully shown to you that Aphantasics do seem to have access to concepts and semantic memory. And I would argue that these semantic memory abilities also going to help to answer the visual details questions, for example, that you do not need to have the image. You could even argue that the other way around, that maybe you can only form the image if you already possess the knowledge in a different form. This is another argument that I don't want to make, but I do want to say that I'm sympathetic towards. Then I've also shown that Aphantasics do report what I have referred to as internal descriptions, external reference, and also spatial sense. And then I've further shown that Aphantasics do show intact spatial imagery abilities, and that they also make use of verbal labels, right? So the idea was that I wanted to show that what we consider to be, or what are classically considered to be visual mental imagery tasks, do not necessarily rely on the use of visual mental imagery, but can be used by alternative strategies. And I think that the alternative strategies approach seems promising in order to solve the puzzle of aphantasia competency. Now, next part. Now I want to show that one possible way of modeling what I've just said can be done in the mental files framework. I do not want to argue that this is the best or the only way, but it is a possible way. So what are mental files? Very basically, mental files can be seen as a sort of mental container, almost, where you collect and integrate information about an object, for example, right? And I will give you a very concrete example in the next slide, but this is just the basics that we want to go through quickly. So there are three components for mental files. Mental files have a label. It is basically what that file is of, what the information that is in the file is about, right? And then there's the cluster of information that is within the file collected. And lastly, there's this anchoring relationship, which basically says like how the file came about or what the file is connected to. Again, I'll give you an example shortly. And the important part for me, for why I think that this can be interesting for modeling alternative strategies approaches, is because the mental files, or the cluster of information in the mental files, can consist of very different sorts of information and also different representational formats, right? And also just, to say that mental files have been used quite successfully, for example, within the philosophy of language, but also recently in developmental psychology and also in philosophy of mind. All right, so here's the example. So let's say that this is the doll, Nina, right? And now we think about, okay, how would a mental file on Nina look like? Well, it could look like this, right? So in blue, you have the label, Nina, the name of the doll, right? And then underneath you have all the different types of information. So just imagine, for example, this is the doll of a child, right? And the child connects all different kinds of like experiences and information with it. So there might be social information, affective information, descriptive information, what is quite relevant in our case, image-like information, right? Like a mental image of what the doll looks like. And then also sensory motor information as well, right? And you can read there like some examples of what that might be like for a specific case. And then the green, or I guess that yellow greenish thing there, this is the anchor, right? So this mental file is anchored in this specific puppet. And now what I would like also to add, based on our previous analysis, would be that I would suggest that we should add also spatial information as a possible representational format. And I will explain you in a second why I think that this would be beneficial. Now, how can mental files help us with aphantasia? Well, I essentially want to argue that aphantasics are using different representational formats than visualizers do during imagery tasks. So different representational formats that are also within the file, but not the same kinds of information, right? And the important part is that they have visual information, but this visual information is not represented visually. It is not represented pictorially or depictively, however you want to formulate it, right? So this brings it back to me saying that visual imagery tasks do not actually require the specific use of the pictorial representational format of visual mental imagery in order to solve them, right? And my proposal, and I'm not saying that this is conclusive or anything, but I think that this would be a promising way of looking at things, is that aphantasics actually use spatially distributed semantic representations in order to substitute for their inability to use image-like representations. So how would that look like? again, the example with the doll. So now we see that here the aphantasic would not have access to the image-like information, right? So there's no visual mental image of the doll. However, we could think, for example, that the descriptive information is extended in such a way that it includes actual descriptive information on the visual features of the doll, right? Semantically speaking, a collection of facts that the doll has a red hat and dress, gray coat, and so on and so forth. And now what I think that the spatial information that I've teased can provide us with is this idea that this information can also be spatially distributed, right? So you will see here that this is roughly, of course, a hominoid shape, right? So the idea is to say, well, if we have spatial information and then we know that something that is represented here is red, well, then most likely would be a hat, right? So maybe this can take off some sort of computational effort necessary in order to hold these facts together. Because when I talk with people, they sometimes say, yeah, okay, but it is hard for me to imagine that there's just like this very long list of facts and then they search through the facts. Well, yeah, maybe spatial imagery or the spatial sense, how some aphantasists called it, can actually be helpful in order to ease that cognitive load by essentially scaffolding it, right? So this is the idea that spatial general information, how does the doll look? Well, the doll looks like a humanoid. We've all seen many, many humanoids, so we have a good intuition on what their spatial distributions are, right? Spatial general information is scaffolding the descriptive semantic information about the visual details without the need for an actual pictorial representation, without the need for actually image-like information. All right. And now we come to the last part. And what I want to do here is, very much work in progress. And I'm actually very curious to hear your thoughts on this specifically, because I think this is very much down your alley. Because now I'm trying to kind of like extend this idea of alternative strategies to a more general framework, which I want to refer to as cognitive substitution. So the idea is the following. Maybe for any task T, there are actually a multitude of cognitive strategies, C1, C2, up until Cn. And the inability to use a specific strategy C1, and you could also say if strategy C1 is dysfunctional, for example, right? Then can be substituted by activating or learning another strategy CJ. And in order to make a bit clear what I mean with this, I want to contrast this with the idea of neuroplasticity, right? So neuroplasticity is the idea that the neural system has the ability to modify itself, right? So structurally, for example, after brain damage, for example, certain parts of the brain can change in structure, take over jobs of other parts, right? So sometimes one part of the brain was responsible for doing X, and then afterwards it also gets the ability to do Y, for example, right? What I want to argue is slightly different than that. I want to argue for what I call cognitive plasticity. And this is, well, essentially the ability of the agent to use cognitive substitution. Now, how can we think about the two in relation? The idea is that whereas neuroplasticity is located specifically at the neuronal, or you could think about it as like the hardware level, the cognitive plasticity occurs at a cognitive, more so a software level, right? So it is the idea that different software can be run on the same hardware. And importantly, this does not need any sort of dysfunction or inability to begin with. I want to argue that there are already these multitude of cognitive strategies laying dormant, so to speak, within us. We're already capable of doing this, but we're just not aware that we have these strategies because we have our go-to strategies that we depend on, right? As in the case for visual mental imaging tasks, we just think because we have the experience of solving it in this way, this is the only way, and then we disregard other possibilities, leading us to the false conclusion or false prediction that aphantasias cannot solve this. Now, no, time is not too bad. Okay, so what are the implications of this? So one thing I already mentioned, so it is this idea that we all have a variety of these cognitive dormant strategies, right? And I know that this is rather vaguely formulated, but again, this is work in progress, so I'm curious what you think about this. And then I was thinking maybe this can be applied in a fruitful way to psychiatry and psychopathology, where instead of maybe thinking that we have to fix a dysfunctional cognitive strategy, we can instead try to think about whether there might be other functioning as of yet dormant strategies that can be used in order to substitute for the dysfunctional strategy. And the idea here is that such an approach might actually be more parsimonious because, again, I argue that these strategies are already there. They just need to be activated. People just need to learn about them, right? And it might also be less invasive than trying to fix something. Again, very curious to hear your opinion on that point. And as an extension of this, I would argue that, for example, mapping out the cognitive strategies of aphantasics, as I've tried to do, for example, in the case of the mental bias theory framework, right, might be helpful for us to actually learn about some thus far neglected cognitive strategies or representational formats and so on and so forth, right? So the last implication I would say is that our cognition, and not just our brain, actually might be more flexible than we initially assumed. Okay, so let us conclude. I have argued in this talk that aphantasia can be viewed as a visual mental imagery dysfunction or inability. And of course, these have different connotations, right? If you call it a dysfunction, this is stronger than just calling it an inability, but you can choose. I will remain neutral for this presentation on what that is. But then I've shown that aphantasics nonetheless are not impaired with respect to mental imagery tasks, so tasks that you would initially expect them intuitively to be impaired at due to their imagery dysfunction, right? And then this brought me to the puzzle of aphantasia competency, which I've argued can be dissolved by arguing that, well, actually mental imagery tasks do not necessarily require the specific representational medium of pictorial representations. There are actually alternative cognitive strategies that can be used. And I've tried to show that this can be fruitfully modeled within the mental fire framework. Then I've extended this to the more general idea of cognitive substitution, where I've argued that these alternative strategies might apply to essentially any cognitive task, right? And I have also said that this would point us towards a sort of cognitive plasticity, which I then compared with neuroplasticity. And then in the end, I suggested that there might be implications for the sector of psychiatry and psychopathology. So in the end, I would like the takeaway message to be, which we can discuss, of course, right? But the idea that a dysfunction only causes impairment if it cannot be substituted for, or maybe a dysfunction only expresses itself as an impairment if it cannot be substituted for. These are my references, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the interruption. You know, the world cannot function without me. And there was something else I had to say, which is just to know we do not have chairs privilege, because otherwise people like me would never shut up. So Sumner and everyone else, please keep their heads up.
Thanks. This was a great talk. Learned a lot. Two quick questions. How is it that determined that someone suffers from aphantasia if they can actually perform all these really advanced tasks? Second question, how does the mental file hypothesis or substitution that you outlined solve that 3D puzzle? Because I don't think conceptually we can rotate this thing to figure out that a certain answer is the correct one. So how is it determined, and how does your proposal shed light on that tricky 3D puzzle?
Yeah. I should have said a bit more general about patient positive success. I had a whole part of this presentation that I essentially had to delete because I ran out of time. But an alternative way of accounting for the puzzle of aphantasia competency isn't to just posit, well, maybe there is no dysfunction in the first place, right? So this can come in two different varieties. But one variety would be to say, well, you know, how do we know that they actually have a good experience, right? Because our experiences are private, and then we actually have to describe them, and then we judge the description. So this is a very like Wittgensteinian kind of like leave it in the box thing, right? And usually, indeed, aphantasia is being assessed by means of self-report questionnaires. So there's like the vividness of visual imaging questionnaire. But announcing the important part, there's also objective evidence that is correlated with results from the self-report method. So there's physiological evidence, for example. So just to name one example, when visualize very bright stimuli like sound, they tend to have a pupillary constriction, right? And this is actually not the case in aphantasics. Another example is aphantasics and visualizers will read scary stories in the dark, which sounds like extremely fun experience. And actually on average use that sweat, right? Which is also kind of like an indirect evidence that they might have a good experience. And then there's more technical examples as well, but also there's emerging neuroscientific evidence as well that there's something different going on. Yes, it is most often based on self-report, but this self-report has to be validated cross-reference. Now, second question, how do we this is just impact station that is happening, right? So if you think about the first object that was or we could say what
impatients have deficient potentials, but they have forces. They can model mean relations, spatial relations of objects without having any different script. I think there's a very good example that because this might sound how do you know space if you cannot see, right? Because you think about waking up in the middle of the night and then you have to go back. I don't know what kind of light is that right wakes me up. So I go to the dark. Now I don't visualize the items in my room, but I have a spatial sense of where these items are, even in the absence of any sort of visual experience. It gives a quite good intuition of how people visualize spatial sense in the absence of visual experience.
Hi. Just a small things about the end when you said we might have latent strategies. I think it could be that we are so flexible that we can invent them because otherwise it would be just too expensive to have those latent strategies. But the most importantly, I told when you say that they have kind of spatial sense, this kind of goes against that they haven't imagination. And one way to believe both that they really don't have imagination, but they have spatial sense is the following. What happens if they cannot put the object into space, even if they somehow understand space, but they can put labels, semantic labels into space, as you said. But that would mean they have a problem with the integration between the space perception and the object perception. And I think that could be because they had much less object, even when they describe what they actually see. And one more thing, did you ask them to answer whether taller and smaller, whether can answer taller, smaller, and such things, because it's very hard to get like 5 people say who is the taller, who is the smaller, but have semantic labels for taller and smaller.
But it's a good suggestion. What I argue is that these strategies can also be, kind of like substituting for each other, right? So somebody who has like a very good spatial sense, they might be able to not have to rely on an external reference object, whereas somebody who has a bad spatial sense might use an external reference object in order to then determine the relative sizing, right? And I think this is also one thing that is very important is that we're really quite in the infancy of aphantasia research. So this term aphantasia was only coined in 2015. There's like a very interesting historical component to that as well. Unfortunately, right? But so we only now figure it out. Maybe they're offering some types of visual. For example, one question would be, is this really, as I suggested, intersect the one end of the spectrum of abilities that I can't use words, or is it a dysfunction of the brain? Most likely, both might be the case, right? Because there is quite a usually there was a damage to the brain, and then they lost the dysfunction. So this is what I want to say about that. And about the semantic distributed labels, spatial distributed. So here I think it's important to not fall into the trap, so to speak, because I also, I show this as visual representation. So it's not that these people see labels floating in the room, right? So it's just more sort of knowledge, right? Again, I wake up in the night, it's dark, I walk in my room, I know that there is my table. I don't see a label table, but I know the table is there. Right? So I think this is like essentially how it works.
Who was the next person?
What type of, memory is impaired in aphantasic patients? Like, is it like episodic memory, or the semantic memory is working fine, right?
Yeah.
And is there any like neurobiological basis? Like, is there any dysfunction associated with hippocampus? And my next question is like, how do they, visualize or see the dreams, right? Is it like just like normal patients? Because there is no like voluntary formation of mental images, like it is involuntary, right? So do they process as normal people do?
Yeah, so this is again a very good question. The guys are asking exactly the right questions that people should be asking. So about the hippocampus, this I cannot fully answer. As I said, like the research into aphantasia is still very much in the beginning, especially like the neuroscientific investigation of it. So I cannot say anything specifically about the hippocampus and aphantasia compared with normal visualizers. The dream question is very interesting, right? Because Yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah, the dream question is actually very interesting, right? Because well, aphantasics report less dream details, but actually more than 50% in some studies did report that they have actually very vivid and visual dreams, right? And this is specifically why in the beginning I made my kind of like working definition of aphantasia be the inability to voluntarily form visual mental imagery, right? Because there's one study, and I think this is a quite interesting study. This is under review, so it's not published yet, but I will still talk about it because I find it fascinating. So they put aphantasics and control subjects into an fMRI scanner, and then they played typical sounds to them that are familiar, right? Like dog barking, for example, would be an example there. And then they looked at the primary visual cortex, because this is usually associated with the depictive representations. Again, very technical, I don't want to go into this specifically, but this is seen as a diagnostic kind of like criteria for whether somebody is having mental imagery or not, neuroscientifically speaking, right? And what they saw is that when they played these sounds and they just told aphantasics to passively attend to the sounds, there was actually some activation in the primary visual cortex going on. But now comes the interesting thing, because then they told them to actually visualize something according to the sounds that they're hearing. And then there was no activity anymore going on. There were no representations. And this is super fascinating because unsurprisingly in control subjects, when they passively listened, they had some sort of visual imagery or, activation in the primary visual cortex. When they visualized, this activation became stronger. But in aphantasics, it was not just the case that this activation during passive listening did not improve in strength, but it actually worsened. It led to an absence of mental imagery, and it even led the researchers to conclude that the very intention of forming visual mental imagery might actually impede with the aphantasics ability to do so. Why that is, I don't know, but this is really hot off the press or still in press, actually. Research. So yeah, thank you.
It's fascinating. Wait, because I have a list. Seth. Yeah, Seth.
So thanks for the talk. I was wondering, so at the end, I think this is somewhat of a follow-up to this question here. You talk about there being different cognitive strategies that we can substitute, and you say that they're latent. But I'm wondering why you would have to commit yourself to that, as opposed to saying that at most the propensity to develop such strategies is latent, and then those strategies are developed in sort of the social linguistic interactions we have with caretakers and the like I can't remember her first name, but Five-ish and a couple others who work on episodic memory have argued, I think, pretty convincingly that there's good reason to think that episodic memory depends for its development on the sort of interaction with caretakers. So I'm wondering, could your view accommodate such sort of social linguistic interactionism?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very good suggestion, and I think I will definitely keep thinking about this. I would not want to exclude it at all, right? So there's, for example, with respect to the object versus the spatial imagery, there's a study I think from Chabris et al. From 2006, where they found out that people might actually have a stronger ability in spatial imagery, but they do have a preference for object imagery as well, right? So this is not that they're unaware that there's like one strategy or something. It's just you have a certain go-to strategy or propensity to do a certain strategy, and 100% I agree that this is of course very much related to your upbringing and childhood and all that. I'm writing right now a paper about this actually, where I talk about how aphantasics. This is something I haven't mentioned, but many congenital aphantasics do not actually notice their inability to visualize until late in their lives. I've talked with people in their 70s or 80s noticing that they are not able to visualize, right? And I'm trying to answer in the paper the question of, okay, how can that be? Like this is what I call the puzzle of aphantasia nations. I have 3 puzzles in total. And this is the question of like how aphantasics can remain unaware of their inability, right? So, and this I argue has everything to do with how we're being brought up, what strategies we're being taught, and how we interact with the world and language, and Wittgenstein a little bit as well. Oh, I can.
Thanks for the excellent talk. One comment, one question. Comment is I wonder whether the case of visual blindness provides a nice complement or analog to the case that you're making in perhaps empirical support, where we know that many people who are visually impaired substitute through echolocation. And I wonder whether that gives some empirical support to this mental files approach that you're presenting. Question I had is about your conclusion that dysfunction only causes impairment when it cannot be substituted. And I wondered about the temporality of that substitution necessity. So consider a case where somebody develops a dysfunction and will substitute in maybe months or years of rehabilitation, but during that time is unable to fulfill that functional role. Would you consider that person during that time of rehabilitation impaired or not?
Yeah, that's it's a good suggestion and a good question as well. So I do like the suggestion. Of course, I do think that, congenital blindness, for example, is indeed, or also acquired blindness would be good cases to look into as well. So I think the general idea that I'm trying to push here, although I argued a lot for aphantasia, is just that we can learn a lot about basically even the normally functioning human beings capable cognitive abilities by looking at the alternative strategies that people who are impaired with respect to one or another sense modality, for example, that they're employing, right? So indeed, any case of sensory substitution, for example, be it via machine or via like some other strategy that you learn. I mean, using machinery in order to substitute for something is a whole different topic that I haven't even touched upon. But yeah, no, I think this is extremely relevant, and this is something that I want to look into more. So definitely. And the other question, yeah, that's a tricky question. Intuitively, I would say like, yeah, no, of course we would say that they are impaired. I guess you could say, well, they just don't know yet that they're not. I don't know, like if that is too tricky, but yeah, I mean, I think the idea is basically to say that, well, there does not need to happen any sort of like neural restructuring necessarily, and therefore it is a less effortful way towards being non-impaired. And yeah, I think that's as far as I would go. But yeah, indeed, in the meantime, if they're really not able to perform like a specific task, and I really have this more of like practical or pragmatic look at whether somebody is, disabled or whether something is dysfunctional with respect to whether they can carry out a task or not. If they can carry out the task, if they cannot carry out a task, then I would agree that they're impaired at that point in time. Indeed, yeah.
Thanks. So this is kind of related. So you were picturing it as there being a dormant class that's activated, but the lots of these cases that you're being pressed on involve significant learning. And I guess another case I might offer you is autism or people with impairments in automatic or relatively automatic tracking of other people's mental states, where again, there's a route to like a mature state that seems much less impaired. But then there's there can be years of learning involved. So I wonder whether you could embrace these cases by changing your terminology and not just thinking of these things as dormant.
Yeah, thank you. This is exactly the feedback I was looking forward to, because again, this is a kind of like broad strokes idea, right? And I do like this sort of feedback. So I think one example, for example, from aphantasia, where we would say there that there's no extensive like relearning involved, is actually the first kind of like case that blew up, in the popular media on aphantasia. This was a case of acquired aphantasia from Professor Adam Seemann in 2010. So he looked at I think it was like a retired surveyor who had a very, very vivid imagery and would use this for all kinds of things, right, in his work as well. And then after a surgery, he would have lost this ability. But very shortly afterwards, actually, he was able to solve, mental rotation tasks and these kind of like visual detail questions and all that, even though this was not at all how he used to solve these tasks. So of course, I cannot overgeneralize, right? Of course, it can be that certain cognitive strategies need longer to accommodate to and to learn how naturally they come to you. This probably also differs based on just the individual, right? People might have a different propensity to learn this specific strategy faster than this other one or not. But I think I can at least take the worry away that in all cases it would take a significant amount of time. So we would then probably have to just map out, maybe you could say in terms of like strategy difficulty or something like this, if this would even be possible. But yeah, no, of course, I do agree that there are nuances that should be taken into account for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's all right.
Thank you so much.